Okay. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out this evening. So, I'm going to be discussing tonight, the topic of the shiur is going to be suicide and MAID, and is there any halachic difference between them, and what are some of the points that we want to bring out from this discussion. So, first of all, what inspired me to speak about this is that, yes, I and we, several of us here in the room, attended recently a conference, the Torah Motion Medical Ethics Conference, and a lot of discussion was related to the topic of mental health, and in particular, the notion of suicide. So I actually was thinking about it a little bit beyond what we heard. We heard a lot about sort of the thoughts about the mental health issues of suicide as it, as one needs to sort of think about it. It is an epidemic. It is something which is becoming more and more common, and it's now, of course, entering pretty much all of our homes in some way. Somebody has, obviously knows somebody, someplace, somewhere. So this is no longer a topic which is, academic and things of that nature. Number two, the focus of the topics there were more about the preventative side of it, rather than focusing on the halachic aspects of it. So I actually wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the halachic aspects, because I see that now the new topic that is, of course, being dealt with is, of course, MAID, medical assistance in dying, and that's becoming very important. And that, too, is something that is affecting the Jewish community, whether we are aware of it or whether we are not aware of it, but it is certainly something there. And the question is going to confront all of us from a halachic perspective. In other words, do we look at MAID in the same way that we would look at suicide? Is there really a fundamental difference? Yes or no, and how do we approach that? So that's really a little bit about my thought process in choosing this topic here this evening. Number one, I want to make a very clear disclaimer. I am not an expert in mental health. Many of you know that's not my field, and I'm not someone who has encountered this from a halachic perspective as a practicing Rav that deals with this at all. So I have really no expertise to speak about this. My affiliation with this really comes from the fact that I think about this probably every day or almost every day, because patients that come to see me are prescribed medication, and one of the side effects that we have to deal with is suicidal ideations with many of the medications that we prescribe. So it's actually on my mind every single day. I deal with a lot of teenagers in which anxiety, if it's acted upon, can obviously lead to that. So I'm very much involved on that side. And we learned in our Chabura, the Halakhah of Avelus, and which comes up in Shin Mem Hey. So we do encounter the Halakhah of Avelus and how it affects this topic, which is in halachic terms it's referred to as Ma'abid Atzmo B'das, which we'll discuss in much more detail this evening. And then the other point I think it's important is that, recognizing that I'm not an expert on any of these fields, it's so important, at least for me, to set at the outset that the sensitivity that needs to be approached when dealing with a topic of this nature is paramount. And it's a little bit daunting, because on one hand, who is qualified to speak about this? On one hand, people would say, how dare you speak? How dare you bring this up? You have no expertise. And I recognize that. On the other hand, we need to have this discussion, and that was part of the emphasis of the conference. We do need to have this conversation, because this is something that is very, very real. It is something that is extremely important to recognize and to deal with. So that is going to be the background, and that's enough of the introductions, but that's really where I'd like to go through. So what I want to do this evening is walk you through a shiur in which I put this together, going through the nature of the prohibition, which we're going to discuss. We're going to go through quickly some of we'll call them biblical and Talmudic exceptions. We have to at least deal with some of these where we have characters in Chumash, Tanakh, and in Gemara, in which exceptions come up, and we have to deal with that. That will, of course, spill into issues, of course, of the Crusades and the Holocaust. And then we're going to get to the crux of which is going to be what is the actual halacha with regards to the issue of suicide. once we have that in place, then the question will be, can we then make the extrapolation to the issue of MAID? So let's begin. So you have your sources in front of you. The first topic that's to be discussed is who says that it is usr. In other words, where do you know the source that this would be something which would be prohibited to begin with? So the Torah tells us, the pasuk is here, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, there is an exclusion. Ach is always described as a miut. Es dimchem lenafsho seichem, your blood for your souls. Edrosh, I will account for. So, miyad kol chayav edrosheno, and so on and so forth, Kadosh Baruch Hu says. So Rashi, quoting a Gemara, basically tells us, what does it mean, ach es dimchem? On one hand, we, the humans, have been given a license to take away the neshama of a behema. So one could make an argument and say, well, we already were given some form of license, so after all, why not maybe extend it to when we feel that it would be appropriate? Pasuk comes and tells us, Es dimchem edrosh. No, mehashofech dam atzmo. So at the end of the day, we are not allowed to commit to do the act of taking one's life, which would be referred to as suicide. Okay, so there's a fascinating discussion that Rav Asher Weiss has on this, which is really much more of a kind of a sugya type of a discussion, which is, okay, so we read the pasuk, we have a Gemara, very nice. So the question is, tell me now a little bit of the lumdus. What exactly is the prohibition? In other words, his question that he begins with is this a prohibition of lo sirtzach, or maybe it's something else? It's the v'nishmartem me'od l'nafsho seichem. And the question is going to be, so what? Ma nafkamina. In other words, let's just explain. Lo tirtzach means you're not allowed to kill somebody. But v'nishmartem me'od l'nafsho seichem means that one has to take care of themselves. So either way, when suicide takes place, it seems that we would be over on both. But is there a difference between the two? So it's a fascinating discussion that he has, which is, he quotes from the Beis Meir in Yoredeya, and he quotes as well from the Chassam Sofer in Yoredeya Shin Chavav, which we're going to see a little bit later on. And he says that these two achronim are of the opinion that in fact it is due to the prohibition of lo tirtzach. Fine. The opposite would be from the Minchas Chinuch. So the Minchas Chinuch is in Mitzvah Lamed Dalet, and the Minchas Chinuch there says that yes, of course, there's a prohibition to be ma'adbeit asmo ladas, to do suicide for sure. However, it has nothing to do with the din of lo tirtzach. So, as I said, what it would be the nafkamina. So there's an important nafkamina that comes out, and that would be the following scenario, and the scenario is a real case that happened a few years ago in Israel. So, for example, we're not talking about, now we know that there's an obligation that we have to help save somebody. Great. What about if the sakana to you is so great that you will actually die? So if it's a suffix sakana, it's a machlokus between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. We paskin like the Bavli, and you're not supposed to go into a risk situation to the point where you would have a significant sakana. The Yerushalmi, on the other hand, says, no, you have to continue up to the point of sakana. But we're not talking about that. What about the scenario in which you are now going to try to save somebody, you will save somebody, your attempt is, but you will certainly die. 100%. Now, what was the case that happened a few years ago? Rowie Klein. Does that name mean anything to people? So Rowie Klein threw himself on top of a grenade, right? He knew full well what he was doing, right? He absorbed the impact, and he died. The question is, and again, this is only an academic discussion, right? We have to be sensitive about the whole discussion. Really, this is really understanding the lumdus that Rav Asher Weiss brings out between the two. It's more of like a yeshivish chakira, but there are people's lives that were involved and a lot of sensitivities that go with it. But Rowie Klein would be a perfect example of the nafkamina between what you have here, machlokas niachronim, between the Chassam Sofer and the Minchas Chinuch. Because if it's lo tirtzach, then it's a non-starter. But if the Isser is v'nishmarta me'od l'nafsho seichem, then yes, you have a prohibition, but you're allowed to decide when and where, how much you're going to be doing that. So that is one example. Another fascinating example, which again, it's amazing to think about, but just think about the following scenario. No, I mean, I have not encountered this yet. Take an elderly parent, right, who has a child who has a condition, who's in the hospital. Let's call it whatever it is, myocarditis, right? The child is in the hospital and has a failing heart. The parent says, you know what? I had a wonderful life. I'll tell you what. You give it to me. Give him my heart. Right? I mean, it's not the kind of thing that you deal with every day, right? And the question is, maybe why not? How is that any different than what Roe Klein does? Right? Maybe more people involved. But ultimately, what's the scenario here? A person is going to say, they want to save their child's life, and what they're going to do effectively is say, you give him my heart. That's the question. It's an absurd thought. It's one of these, logic ad absurdum that you'd have to carry out, but the reality is, this is totally in this machlokes. According to the Chassam Sofer, this would be a non-starter, because the prohibition of achas dimchem comes from lo sirtzach, and there really is no way around that. On the other hand, if you're going to learn like the Minchas Chinuch, that it's going to be possibly v'nishmarta me'odas nafshaseichem, there may be a lot of leeway here. Now, I should just point out that Rav Asher Weiss right away says right from the start that this is not going to paskin out la halacha, but it's a fascinating conversation to have in terms of understanding what it is that we are dealing with. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background to get into the sense of what are we dealing with. Now, the trouble with all of this discussion is that if you open the Tanakh and start working your way, you will find cases in which there are references to some suicide. And the question is, do we take the approach which is, all of these people were terrific, wonderful, gedolim, and they never did anything wrong, and we have to find a reason to justify their approach, which might be reasonable. And then there's the others amongst the Meforshim that would say, call it what it is. This is what it is. So no conversation with this about the topic of suicide goes without discussing at least Shola Melech, right? For one, Rabbi Chananya ben Tradion, and there's many more. But I want to go through a little bit about each one of these briefly, and I want to basically just encapsulate the stories quickly enough to be able to understand them, and then see justifications that are brought down either in the Rishonim or the Achronim as to how these were going to work. So, the intent, by the way, is not to do a shir on the justifications for Shaul HaMelech. That could be a discussion on its own, fully, a whole discussion about why and how Shaul HaMelech was. But just to understand Shaul HaMelech. So just, if you look at your notes, Shaul HaMelech, the pasuk in source number 3, Vayomer Shaul lenasei kailov shalaf charbacha udakreni. He basically says, draw your sword, and I want you to essentially to spear me. Pen yovo ha'arelim, because the arelim, the Gentiles are going to come upon me. Udekarnani v'hisalulu bi, and they will essentially they will make a bizayon. We'll leave it at that. Below avo nasa kelov, and of course the lad says, I'm not doing this. This is the king. This is Shaul HaMelech. Ki arei me'od vayikach sholas ha'cherev vayipol aleha. Very, very explicit. Shaul HaMelech falls on his sword. As the expression is, he falls on his sword. End of discussion. That is what it is. That's number one. The story of Rabbi Chananya ben Tradion is a tragic story. The Gemara is an Avodah Zarah. I'm not going to read through. Maybe I'll tell you a little background. The issue was, of course, the Romans forbade learning Torah. There was a machlokus in whether it should be done in private or it should be done in public. Rav Chananya ben Tradion said, I want to defy them and I want to do it in public. And he was Marbet Torah b'kelos, and he did it in public. And of course, one day he was caught. And the story, as I'm sure we all know from the Asarei Harugei Machlus, and it's the centerpiece of Yom Kippur davening, and we have it on Tisha B'Av as well. So it's one of the Harugei Malchus, and he's wrapped up in swigs of cotton, and in order to sort of preserve him. so that he shouldn't die quickly, and he's placed on the fire. And we'll pick it up from there. So the Gemara here tells us, the Talmidim said to him, Rabbi, open up your mouth and let the fire come and consume you. So he says the following. Now, when we're going to learn this story, again, we have to understand which side is Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion going by. In other words, we'll see the story. I'll pause and we'll see what I mean by that. So initially, Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion says the following. Omar Lahen, he tells his Talmidim, Mutav sheyitlano mishenitna, it's better that the person who gave me mishenitna va'al yachbol hu ba'atzmo, and one should not be mechabel, which should not injure on his own. So at this point, Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion seems to be of the opinion that one does not take one's own life. You have to wait for Kadosh Baruch Hu no matter what. But the story doesn't end there. The story continues with the executioner. So the executioner, Amar Loi Kaltstuniri, that is the name of the executioner, and he makes a deal with Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion. He says as follows: Rabbi, im ani marbeh b'shal heves, if I'm going to increase the flames, v'notel sifugin shel tzemer me'al libcha, and if I remove some of the cotton that is on the wool that is on your heart, that is slowing the process down. Question, are you going to let me have chaya olam haba? So Amru lo, so Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion says, Hein, absolutely. Hishaballah, he makes him promise, Nishbalo, he promises, and then of course, Miyad, Harbe beshal heves, v'natas fugin shatzame me'aliba, yotza nishmasa b'mehera. Now, let me ask you, in this second half of the story, what did Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion do? The first...
Hastening his death.
He's allowing someone to hasten his death. So the question is, in the story of Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion, when you want to use him as a champion for, which side are you bringing him for? Right? Are you bringing him for the side that says, he says, in the first part, he says, mutav, he says, shi'itlanu mishenitna, right? Better, no, I can't do anything. Wait. On the second half, he says, to the executioner, I make you a deal. So that's a question.
It's only fast. Still, Hashem is taking it.
Yes. So in the first instance, there's no resistance whatsoever. We wait. And the second one, there is a concept that says one can hasten it up to a point. He's allowing that. So Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion remains to some extent an enigma. Okay? That's Leon?
There seems to be a difference between active and passive.
Oh. So that's what a lot of people are going to look at. In other words, active or passive. And the other difference, of course, is another person involved. Right? Those are the two fundamental pieces. So we'll keep those in mind, and we'll see how we can reconcile them. We're not going to be able to square all of the circles, but we'll try our best. The next Gemara that I want to highlight is the Gemara in Gittin, and we learned this, of course, on Tisha B'Av. It's one of the Gemaras you're allowed to learn. So the story here is of the 400 Yiladim, the Yilados. So the Gemara tells us, Ma'aseh b'dalad meos Yiladim v'Yilados, that there are 400 boys and 400 girls. Shenishbu lekalon, they were essentially captured. Here, Gishu Batzma Lama Hein Misfakshim. They realized what the intent of the captivity was for, and it was basically for lewd sexual practices. That was they realized, they dawned upon themselves. They said, "Oh my, this is what's going to happen." So what happens? So the girls said first, "Im anu tovim bayam anu boin l'chay olam haba darash lahen hakadosh shebehen." So they learned Omar. They said like this: Hashem, he brings a pasuk to say, yes, this is going to be. Kivin sheshomu yaldos kach. So sorry, the boys would said. So then the kivin sheshomu yaldos kach. So when the girls heard this as well, kafza kulan v'naflu tochayam. They went inside and they jumped into the ocean. All 400 of them. Nasu yuladim kal v'chomer. And now the boys made a kal v'chomer. So the 400 girls jumped into the ocean and essentially killed themselves. The boys then decided, however, we're going to translate that the girls are, I'm not even going to translate that. Okay? Anu, she'ein, the boys, she'ein darkenu lekach, alachas kama v'kama, afheim kafzu l'tochayam. Okay. Point being is 800 Jewish children throw themselves into the sea, knowing that they were facing a life of sexual impropriety. Last Gemara that we're going to look at Those are the three. Now, the others that, like again, we could spend the entire shiur discussing. There's Tzidkiyahu, there's Masada, there's the Crusades, there's a fascinating tour that maybe we'll touch upon later on, an amazing tour that is brought down in Yoredeya in terms of thing. And then, of course, that doesn't even come near any of the questions of the Holocaust, which were replete of these type of questions. So, what I want to basically show you now is what I went through, 4 different approaches to the justification of all of these cases, right? So as opposed to picking one, what are some of the potential ways of learning it? So the first one is basically the notion of, in the face of torture, one would be permitted to be ma'abed es atzmo ladas. Okay? Now, what does exactly mean the level of torture? For now, we will discuss and say that it is by a third party, right? We'll come to later on what other kinds of torture there are, but this is basically the part that there will be. The sources for that are going to be, of course, there are many. The Otzos Kenim in Sanhedrin, the Rambam in Torah Adam, and here I want to show you Tosfos in Gittin, okay? So the Tosfos in Gittin is basically the number A. So A is going to be one of the 4 that we're going to look at, and it's on our Gemara. So Tosfos basically says, Tosfos is bothered. What is bothering Tosfos? Tosfos says, listen, isn't everybody familiar with the story of Reb Chananya ben Tradion? Part A, i.e., you're not allowed to give up your life? So why is it that the girls, what drasha did they make to justify that they can now jump into the water? I mean, Rabbi Chananya ben Tradion said, no, mutal, right? The expression, of course, is mutav shiitlanu mishenasno. So, Tosfos in A. Kaftu kulan v'naflu tzachayam. So the Gemara says, "Nu v'had amar b'mseches avodah zarah." We just quoted that we learned together. Mutav shiitlanu mishenasno v'al yechabel atzmo, and a person should not. So Tosfos' answer is hacha yireim hayu miyisurin. In other words, I initially said, what was their concern? Their concern was sexual impropriety. But that it wasn't that. Seems like Tosfos had to say something else, because that on its own may not be a reason, right? I mean, that may or may not. I mean, that's a discussion whether they should be giving up their lives, that they're going to go there, but giving up a life is different than being ma'abed es atzmo ladas. Right? In other words, if it's one of the 3 cardinal sins, you have to give up your life, but that doesn't mean that one takes their own life. So even if they knew that that's what it was. Tosfos then says, no, there was another reason for it. And the other reason is they were afraid of Yisurin, when there's going to be this idea of torture. So, and then he continues later on that v'od imkein dal karcha hayu ma'anin osan v'lo hayu hargin osan. We're going to come to this second reason in a moment. The second concept that we see is the concept that it was going to be a person will not be able to resist the sin of avodah zarah, and that is the second answer of Tosfos, which he quotes here right in front of you, and it's with regards to Hananya, Mishoel, Vazariah, another one of the classic from Tanakh where they threw themselves into the fire lest they were to do any avodah zarah. Now, turn the page now, and we're going to look at C. So in C, we have a shach here that is going to tell us. This is the shach in, I told you, Kuf Nun Zayin. This is where there's a fascinating tour. We'll come back later on. No, let's just actually discuss the tour right now. So the tour brings down that his wife, the mother-in-law, and the mother-in-law's husband they all took their own lives during the times of the crusade. They all took their own lives. And there was a big machlokus in the community if it should extend also to the families and the children. So we're going to see that. I'm sorry? Whether they should take the lives of their own children. And the tour brings down that they did, and they actually took much like Masada.
Right.
Basically, another Masada that happened quoted by the Tur, and the machlokus was whether that was correct or not. And one of the Rabbanim Paskin, he said, "Well, I think you're wrong, and the proof is going to be that you're going to have what's called a misa mishuna. You're going to have a very, very deviant type of a death." And sure enough, that person had a very deviant type of death. So this is where the Shach is coming in on this discussion here. So that's the background. Says the Shach. Because of Bagos Asmak, he says, the Osan Kedoshim Sheshachtan Atzman. Those, and again, see how he refers to them? Kedoshim. Sheshachtu Atzman, Shelo Samchu Datam Lamod B'Nisayon. They did not think that they would be able to stand to the Nisayon. Kedoshim Gemurim Haim. They are absolutely Kedoshim and Gemurim, complete. Varaya Mishol, and he brings the proof from, of course, Shaul HaMelech, Umeviyabach, he brings it down over here, Cholkim She'en Yochel, and he brings another dissenting opinion. But here, the Shach, referring to that kind of a story, says that these people were absolutely permitted in what they were going to do. And the last source to look at is from the Yam Shel Shlomo, the Marshal. It's Gemara in Baba Kama, and here he discusses specifically Shaul. What was Shaul's thinking? So a lot of people discuss Shaul. There's so many answers for Shaul. Shaul was the king. It would have been a bizoin for the king. Here, the Yam Shel Shlomo offers another answer, another fascinating answer, which is Shaul niva me'achashash. You know what he was worried about? She'im yipol chai. If they would leave him alive, lidei hapilishtim yasu Yisrael. Ma'amtzim l'shachro mehashavi. They would actually try to save him, right? But it would be a lost cause. V'yamusu rabim, and many people will die. V'lepekuach nefesh acherim muter lachbol atzmo. So what was he doing, Shalom Melech says? What was he doing? He was Rowie Klein, right? He was Rowie Klein. He was the first Rowie Klein. He basically said, I'm going to kill myself now. Why? Because if I survive, you know what will happen? They're going to send up one commando unit, another commando unit, and they will just continue dying. This heter of the Marshal now, very, 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 we'll go back to this crazy case that I said, can a parent give their child a heart? Right? I mean, if someone wants to pull out a Marshal, you would say, hold on a second. I have a quote here. So again, when it comes to these, Rav Asher Weiss is very, very, very quick to point out we're not going to paskin on the basis of, but as much as these are our achronim that help us understand the sugya and the Gemara, whether you're going to translate that to Piskei Halakhah, Rav Asher Weiss is not ready to go that far. But this is an interesting concept because if it's simply put, if it's good enough for Shaul HaMelech, right? Right. Oh, okay. So Rowie Klein versus an individual. Einochinami. Okay. So again. And again, I'm not here to in any way try to justify what Rowie Klein did. Everywhere that you read about him, tzaddik, gomer, kedoshim for sure. But just in terms of the learning exercise. So what you said is 100% right. There was a rabbim. There was a whole platoon. He basically said, I have a whole platoon. That is basically the argument of Shaul HaMelech. So would you extend it as far as the individual comes to the ICU and says, no, you're looking for a heart? This boy needs a heart. We'll go from there. Okay?
What's the implication of the Chayal that get captured knowing that they are going to send a team to try and rescue him?
So, right. So it's interesting, and this is like a whole interesting discussion, which obviously I don't want to go there, but here's the concept. The question is, what is the chiyuv? This was the topic of the shir, which is, what is the responsibility to free a soldier, right? What is the responsibility? So 2 points emerge from this always. The Israeli army always says to to the recruits, we will always go after you. You're not going to be left hung to dry. That's number one. But it gets into much broader questions, which is, are you allowed to, and how much, and things like that. But again, if you were just to sit back, you're in your study, and you're going to pontificate now, and you're going to say, I have a Yam Shel Shlomo here. Maybe it's not such a good idea. If you start doing this process where you say, well, it's one versus many, right? Someone's going to say, don't bother coming to get me. A whole platoon's going to come and get me, and things like that. So, but that's the discussion that is there. Okay, so now let's move on to the question that we skirted out before, which is Rabbi Hananya ben Tradion. In other words, now the question of Rabbi Hananya ben Tradion was the first one in which he said, okay, it won't be he himself, but he allowed the executioner to do it for him, right? So this is where I said I was going to bring in the Beis Yosef and the Beis Yosef in Bedek Abayis in Yoredei and Kuf Nun Zayin. He discusses, and I'll just repeat: the wife of the tour, the mother-in-law, and her husband all took their lives during the crusade. So the poskim basically want to say, where does this come from? Where does this idea come from? So maybe from the Gemara, Avodah Zarah, from Hananya ben Tradion, we see that there may be some of this. And the question is, does it extend to the family? So where the heter might come from is only because one would look at it and say that extension is from where? Because you're letting another person do it. So there's a difference between Shaul HaMelech, right, and Rabbi Hananya ben Tradion. There's a fundamental difference between the two of them. Halakhah l'maisa. Again, you look in the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef, by telling us the story that the fellow who paskin, I shouldn't say the fellow, the Rav who paskin in that way had a misa meshuna. The Beis Yosef is trying to tell you that wasn't the right psak. But if that's not the right psak, then you have a big question on Masada. And everybody goes up to Masada, and everybody goes up there, and we revere what was done there. But again, how did Masada work? So if you're going to say that each one took their own life, right? Josephus has a right. So each one took their own life. The question was, who took the last life? How did the last two go? Right. So it's not like there was a designated person and they went around. So everybody took their own lives. That, again, is supposedly how it worked. But at the end, there was, and I don't remember the details. Somebody remembers it. I remember it was one of these Josephus kind of discussions.
They killed the children. 100 people killed the children.
Maybe the little ones, yeah, that's one. But all the adults they killed. They basically.
Yeah, but the children were killed.
And that's the problem. And that is fundamentally a there's no question of problem. Okay, so. Now, what we're going to do is spend some time learning the halachas of what turns out to be suicide. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of the exceptions, we have a concept of what it's going to be like. So we're going to learn, I'm going to break this up into two. I'm going to break this up into what we're going to call classic halacha of suicide. Classic means what? How you learn a regular piece of halacha. You begin with a Gemara. You see how the Rishonim deal with it. You come to the Shulchan Aruch. And there is your psak. And that's going to be classic halacha. And then we're going to see what happens to that halacha afterwards. And it'll be when the Chasam Sofer comes around. What happens after that? But until the Chasam Sofer, we're going to learn like any sugya we do. What does the Gemara say? So there is something called Masechtas Ketanos. Masechtas Ketanos are, as the name implies, the small Masechtas. And they are found in the back of the Gemara. And they include Sefer Torah, Mezuzah, Tefillin, and Smachos. Smachos is always the euphemism for something which is, Binyani Smachos. It's the euphemism for negative things. We always refer to it in a sort of, in a positive way. Binyani Smachos. So let's look at the Gemara. So the Gemara tells like this. So we're going to learn 3 halachas now in Maseches Ketanos, and it's going to be repetitive, and I apologize for it, because what we're going to do is we're going to see it in the Gemara, we're going to see it in the Rambam, I'm going to see it in Shegen and Shulchan Aruch, but I'm doing it purposely so that we really get the point that this is derived from a Gemara. So the first thing is, what is the halacha with regards to the person who has been involved in suicide? Now, what is that individual called in Hebrew? It's called Hama'abed es atzmo bedas. That is the term, okay? Ma'abed atzmo bedas. So the halacha is, we start already with the completed act. So halacha aleph, Hama'abed es atzmo bedas, ein misaskin imo bechol davar. You do not do anything for that individual, period. Now, 2 opinions in terms of how far we do that. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Korin alav havei nishlacha havei nishla. You know what you say about him? You just basically kind of say, Oi, that poor vessel. Omer Rabbi Akiva, no, that's not sensitive. Hanach lo bistamo. Leave him alone. Don't say anything. Don't give him a bracha. Don't give him a curse. Leave him alone. Halacha l'maisa, Ein korin, we do not do kriya. Ve'ein cholzin, you do not take off any of the shoes. Ve'ein maspidin olav, you don't do a hesped. Aval omdim olav b'shura, as you know, when we go after the burial, the people go in a line and they accept birchas tanchumim, ve'omrim olav birchas abelim. Why? So this we learned very well. Semi knows we learned this. This halacha, very, very fundamental. We learned with Rabbi Baruch in Shin Mem Hey in halachas of Avelus that there's a fundamental difference between what is referred to as the kavod hachayim versus kavod hames. We make a big deal of kavod hames. Very, very important notion of kavod hames. However, there's also kavod hachayim. So here, these items that the Gemara says we still do for someone who has been the victim of suicide, that person is we still do kavod hachayim. Klala shel davar, and what is the principle? Kol shehu lekavod hachayim harabi misaskin bo. If it's going to be for the kavod of the chayim, the family of the deceased, v'chol she'eino lekavod hachayim ein harabi misaskin bo. That is the halacha. Okay, now. What? We have to get some definitions. So Halakhah Beis and Halakhah Gimel are going to tell us what are the definitions of suicide. What is the considered what is the definition of ma'abed es atzmo b'das? So the Gemara the halachas for the Gemara tells us like this: Lo she'ala l'rosha ilan v'nafal v'meis. It is not talking about someone who goes up to the top of the tree and falls and dies. V'lo l'rosh hagag, or to the rooftop v'nafal v'meis, and he falls and he dies. Elozeh she'omar. It's not that sounds like an accidental fall. He goes up and he falls down. We're not talking about that. Elozeh she'omar hareini. In other words, hareini muchan. I am hareini ole l'rosh ha'ilan. I'm going up to the ilan ole l'rosh hagag va'apil atzmi va'amus. And I wish to inflict upon me death, and I will die. Then that's not enough. V'ra'uhu, and they see she'ala l'rosh ha'ilan v'nafal v'meis ole l'rosh hagag v'nafal v'meis. So what's required? Not just an accidental fall. Someone has to be a witness to the fall, and there has to be some sort of a declaration in advance that says, this is my intention. Then go refer back to Halacha A. Halacha Gimel. Now we did not have the opportunity to hear his declaration, but rather he is found. Harug u'moshlach al gabi asayv, or he's fallen over a sword. Harehuch becheskas ma'abed atzmo. What's the next word? Sheloladat. Right? That is not the definition of suicide. And here the Gemara doesn't go into the details yet of, well, how can you tell the difference? But v'chol ha'mabed sheloladas ein monin hemenu kol davar. In other words, the principles have been laid out in the Gemara. That if you do not meet those criteria, right, but rather you have person that falls over a sword, right? The implication in Halacha Gimel is it's pretty obvious that the person fell over the sword. Like, what else do you want? He fell over the sword. There's nobody else in the room, right? We're going to see later on how far is this going to go that you're going to take this assumption. But there's a new term that we have, ma'abed atzmo. Sheloladas. That is a new definition. That is something different. And what is that? That's a regular death. And for that, you ain monin lo anything, nothing at all. You do everything. Ain monin mimene kol davar. So as I said, we're going to end up repeating a lot because we're going to just see a couple of changes and nuance between the Rambam. Hamabed Asma, I'm going to read this a little bit more quickly. Hamabed Asma ladas, ein misaskinim o lechol davar, ve'ein misablin olav, ve'ein maspidin oso, avol omdim olav b'shura, ve'ormen olav, birchas abelim, v'chol davar shu kavod l'chaim. Sounds like very much like what we had just learned here. I want to pick up from here. Avol. Imra'u chanuk v'talu bi'ilan o harug mushlach. The truth is, from the Rambam, he's just literally cut and paste. Shulchan Aruch, how do we paskin? Paskin's like the Rambam. Hama'abed atzmo ladas, ein misaskim mo lechol davar, ve'ein misablin alav, ve'ein maspidin oso, v'lo korim, v'lo cholzin, avol omdim alav b'shura alav. Everything is pretty much the same story. Okay. The Shulchan Aruch, in his definition of Ma'abed Atzmo B'das in Sif Beis, Ezu Ma'abed Atzmo B'das, Kagoin, I think he's going to tell us over here, but I think that I wanted to see if there is any more. No, so it doesn't come from here. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins exactly like the Rambam, no surprises, we follow the Gemara. So for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the halacha was that if a person was felt to have been the victim of suicide, the halacha was. And this is where I think a lot of people, I didn't ask, what do people think about the myth or is it a myth or is it not a myth? Can they be buried in a Jewish cemetery or not? So there was a section always that had for people that were not part of that was one of the things. So this was the halacha for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, that was the notion that this is what you do. You do not bury someone who has done a suicide.
Was that actually done? They were actually buried in the psychedelic?
100%. So again, the game changer is going to come on the next page with the time of the Chassam Sofer. Because even if you read this, basically, here's what it is. The understanding was, if a person says, Hareini, in other words, I'm going to go do it, and you saw him do it, fine. But here, the definition of when they found him, they sort of made assumptions that said, oh, it looks like a suicide. It looks like a suicide, and therefore, for sure, for many generations, there's many tshuvas that are written about not being maspid people and things like that. 100%. This was going on. The game changer happens with the Chassam Sofer. So, if you look at the Chassam Sofer, it's a tshuva that I hope we have some time to read a little bit inside. This is a sugya shir, so I think that I'm hoping to read a little bit inside, because here is where you're going to see what happens in terms of just a total change in approach. Because up until this point, you open a Shulchan Aruch, right? So remember, Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo, Tzfat, 16th century. Chassam Sofer, Pressburg, 18th century, very, very different story, right? A completely different picture that we're going to merge and what he sees. Okay, so in the first paragraph, what the Chassam Sofer is basically going to talk about here is going to say, you remember that we made that point about Me'abed Atzmo Ladas? That is the definition, but then we were introduced to a new term which was called Me'abed Atzmo Shelo Ladas.
Can I ask a question? In terms of the two concepts that you discussed before, about whether it's from murder or whether it's a nafsha or whatever you call it, would be a difference in terms of the thinking in terms of Ma'abed thing? In other words, is there more of a, if you say that someone kills himself and he's murdering himself, is that worse than someone who, the opposite, is not watching?
So this, this is from Rav Asher Weiss. He basically says, according to the Chassam Sofer, who would say that it's from Lo Tirtzach, there would be no ability to be able to do it for any justifiable reason.
And so any suicide, even if you think it's a suffix, it would be
it's Ma'abed, right? And so it becomes a much more strict halacha.
Right.
So the Minchas Chinuch, and again, he wasn't interested in being machriya between the two, but he wanted to just explain the lumdus.
Halakhah was more to the point of killing when you kill yourself, it was more because it was closer to murder.
100%.
100%. And then it's shifted to more.
We'll see. We haven't gotten there, but yes, 100%. We're laying it out. We're laying it out such that the halacha was that was the case.
Why don't we not talk about the reason why people do commit suicide when it's not their fault and they're sick? Where is that? That's the concept.
This is the grain. In other words, we think, that mental health, woke up in the 20th century. You know what? Listen to the Chassam Sofer. I'm going to hope to go through it inside, and this is the game changer. The game changer happens at the time of the Chassam Sofer. Yeah. Thank you. Correct. So you see, I glanced. I knew I saw that somewhere, and then when I looked at the Rambam quickly when I was learning with you now, I said, oh, he's just paraphrasing, but he adds that. Thank you, Harold Shkoyach. Go back to the Rambam, okay? Because that's the first glimpse here that we have. Number 7, third line. I knew. I said, okay, good. Shkoyach. Ra'u shalom miyad derech. So he goes up like this. Let's go over here. What is considered a person who does this suicide? Lo she'ola legag v'nafal meis, not that he happened to fall. Ela ha'omer hareini ola l'rosh hagag, right? Period. Ra'uhu she'ala miyad derech kas. They saw that he went up and he was angry. O shehaya meitzar. Right? V'nafal v'meis. He was disturbed and he died. Harei zeh becheskas she'avad atzmo ladas. So the Rambam still is of an opinion that even when you have this anger and things like that, it's still considered atzmo ladas. Okay? Now, Aval Imro Chanuke v'Tolu be'ilan harugu mushlach al gabi seifer hareze becheskas kol hamesim misaskim. But if you're just found, hanging on a tree, even though we can make assumptions, but the Rambam in that point was still of the opinion that even anger is not yet to the point of any, you're still culpable and responsible. Okay, game changer. Let's look at the Chassam Sofer. So the Chassam Sofer basically goes through this. I want to go through it a little bit inside. I hope that's okay with everybody. So number 9, right at the very top, we're going to go through it. Nearly the habraisa nishanet b'dikduk al das lozu afzu. There's a concept in Shas called lozu afzu. In other words, you bring two cases, you're going to be comparing them. Umayri b'vava kamaita b'mishe anu ro'in olin be'ilan b'lishum siba. He goes up without any reason. She'aviyu l'olam sham ki ein lo sham shum melacha. He has nothing to do up there. V'lo shum tzorech. He has no need. Umiyad nafal. He falls. So you would think that the end should be like the beginning, right? He had no purpose in going up there. So therefore, l'sham still ain monin. We do not take anything away from him. We don't know mitmunasav. We don't know what really was. And here's one of the several punchlines in the Chassam Sofer. Umi yodeya machshavos b'nei adam. How do you know what is in a person's mind? You don't know. The Chassam Sofer is writing this, and he's laying down the groundwork. He's saying you don't know. Go weiter. Velozu bilvad. Not just this alone. Elo afilu amar behedja. Let's take it to the next level. The first level is he goes up and he doesn't make it very very explicit. Let's make it more explicit, says the Chassam Sofer. Velozu bilvad. Not only this. Remember, this is a lozu afsu gemara. Elafilu amar behedja. He says explicitly, Hareini ole al menas lahapil atzmi. I'm going up with the intent of falling. V'gam ra'inu. We see him going up. Ole. Ach, what is it? Lo ra'inu nofel umes. The third part we didn't see. He says he's going up. We see him going up the tree. We get distracted, we answer the iPhone. We turn around, he's on the ground. You have 2 out of the 3 parts already. Right? You can make an assumption. Not according to Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer says, you didn't see him fall. Lo ra'inu nofel umes me'osa haliyah lagag af al gav she'achar zman matzuna nafal. You find him shedod bos hamakam. He's right there. He said he was going to go up there. He fell on the ground. It's of course where he was up. Mamash mikol makam kivon shelo ra'inu. You didn't see him fall. No fail. Me'osa aliyah be'atzma. Shama yala be'atzma. Lo dainina leikema avid atzma l'das. You see how much leeway the Chassam Sofer is giving now? He's saying, he told you he was going up the tree. He told you. You saw him go up the tree. You turned around and you find him in the place where he should have landed. Not good enough. This reminds you of the Gemara. Remember, he comes into a room and then it's full of blood and there's a sword. That's the kind of Gemara. You want to ask a question?
What happens if he's going to commit suicide? He said he's going to commit
Yes.
suicide. He goes up to the tree,
Right.
the roof,
Yeah.
and then he changes his mind, and then he had the accident.
Exactly. That is exactly what the Chassam Sofer says. Until you see all 3 parts, you cannot make that judgment.
But even if you see him falling down, right, maybe he had an accident.
Hold on. Keep going. Elahu adinami b'maseh gomor. Now, he's going to say he did the act. Kivan shera'inu chanuk v'talu bi'ilan al-osan ofan shenira b'vada shehu ba'atzmo talo. It is clear that he hung himself, right? Ve'ira kain shenimtza talu b'cheder. He's found hanging in a room. Ve'hacheder sagur mipnim, and it's sealed from the inside. Be'ofen shenira shehu sagur ba'atzmo, that it's closed on it. Naful ala saif, or he falls upon the thing. Harezeh chazaka she'ibed atzma b'yadoy. We would have thought that this would be a chazaka. Mikol makom. here's the next piece that he introduces. Shelo midas. This is considered ma'amed be'atzmo, shelo midas. Why? That's the point you made. Haya de talinan ruach ra biatato betunova nakitla. A bad spirit got him. He was ready. He wanted to do everything that you wanted to do. Not that the bad spirit was there to begin with, but something happened in between. The point here is the Chassam Sofer is giving incredible amount of leeway to this individual. Continues. So what does this mean? Onis yarei, or he was scared. Something's going to happen. Kishol, maybe it would be like Shol HaMelech. That's so he says, Ad shenishma mipiv, until you hear it from his mouth. Mitoch yishuv hadas, and he is of clear mind. Shehu ole machmas kas o meitzar, lashon of the Rambam, right? Shedakte karambam bilshono perik al milchas vav zulas laolam anu tolin o shelo ibed atzmo klal o inami ibed atzmo mikol makam haya shelo midas ubazeh kol divrei habraisa mudvalim utkanim l'may. In other words, you basically until you get all of those points, he said it explicitly. He went up. You saw him. You saw him come down. There was no time frame in between. All of those must be there.
And he was angry.
And there was a reason there. Now he gets into a halachic discussion. The Rambam versus the Ramban. I don't think we need this right now, but basically there is a machlokas. We'll just say it outside. There is a machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban in the case of someone who is a victim of suicide. And the Rambam, as we saw, says ein misablin alav. The Ramban in Torah Adam, he argues palik. I'm in the second to last paragraph, and he says ilav de misablim aleim hayashayich lamod alav b'shura. He sees that the standing in the shura. I don't want to get into the technical difficulties. I just want to bring this out that we paskin like the Rambam. So now next paragraph. So the Chassam Sofer is now bothered. Now what's he going to do? He learned this whole Gemara, and now he's stuck because what happened? The great Rambam already learned this halacha, and the Shulchan Aruch cut and pasted from the Rambam and plugged it in and did not come to the same conclusion. How does he deal with it? V'hine lahalacha ulamase mi yarim rosh neged ha'ra'a v'haskamas he basically says Rabbi b'Shulchan Aruch. Who's going to challenge? We're talking about Shulchan Aruch and we're talking about Rambam. We can't, And there he quotes in Siman Shin Mem Hey, Shesasam kaharambam, that he paskins like the Rambam. So he says, yes, we know that there is a principle that whenever there is a machlokes in Avelus, it's the time that it's the only place that you probably will have everybody agreeing on one thing. If there's a machlokes in the halachas of Avelus, you go l'kula. That is across the board, not l'chumra. That is generally speaking. Now, says as follows. You're not going to tell me that you're going to be makel like the Rambam. What you're going to be makel on is going to be a chumrah to someone else. Namely, Amnam mikol makom omerani, says the Chassam Sofer. Heichi deika kavod mishpacha nichbedes asher yeh lahem lavus uliklimas olamit she'echad mehem kilkel ma'asav v'im yatir lahem hamoreh lisabel. Now you're going to say that you're going to do avelus for them. Oz yom rabrius. What are they going to say? Kamu bi rabbanu b'milsa b'nizbar shelo hoya loydin me'abid atzmo ladas azah yochol hamoreh laharos lechatchila lisabel. So he basically is saying, I know that the Rambam said, I understand it then, but there is a concept here which is kavod mishpacha. He basically will leave us with two thoughts. Number one, most importantly, and I want to quote, Umi yodeya machshavos b'nei adam, number one. And number two, in his last statement is, Unehi de le'inyan avel halacha divra mekil, aval le'inyan pegam mishpacha, ein halacha kahamekil. You can be makel on halachas hilchas avelus. Don't be makel on kavod mishpacha. And here, b'chavod b'nei Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yakov, he's talking about here. So basically, Chassam Sofer single-handedly changed the entire notion of what we interpret as suicide. So any remnants in any community whatsoever that is not practicing in this way, so what is the practical halacha? And again, I have no personal experience, I have nothing to tell you, but the idea, and this idea that we bury outside of the cemetery, there doesn't exist anymore according to the Rambam, according to the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer is willing to give you an incredible amount of leeway and latitude that basically almost says, and I'm going to point out in the Gesher HaChaim now, which is the Halakhah L'maisa Sefer, we'll see it inside how far it's going to go, and we'll see where we are. So in the Gesher HaChaim, the Gesher HaChaim is like, it was written by Rav Michal Tukashinsky, and it is the compilation of all of the halachas, the maisa of the 20th century, of essentially the halachas of Avelus. So he has a chapter we learned together. It's underlined for a reason. Right, Simi? Mi nikra ma'abid atzmai. Berov hamekarim hanirim ma'abdim atzmo ladas, rachmana litzlan, ein ledonam din ma'abid atzmo ladas. So his introduction is, you're going to be hard-pressed to ever find a real, legitimate case of halachic suicide since the days of the Chassam Sofer. Yes, if you're going to bring out the Shulchan Aruch, you're going to tell me one thing. But since then, this is now paskening halacha l'maaseh. Ki choma she'efshar litlos she'achar hargo. Anything that you can find, any tzad to explain, afilu ba'ofen rachok me'ametzios, even if it is far-fetched, or he was confused, he was mevulbal, there was some confusion in his mind. Maybe, as you pointed out, he had regret. He was about to do it, yes, he was about to fall in debt, but he regretted it. All of those things are ma'abed atzmo shelo ladas. And for that reason, says the Gesher HaChaim, Tolin lekula umamidin also becheskas lo rotzeach nafsho. Look at his language, Gerard. Lo, it's not a rotzeach nafsho. Okay. In the next paragraph here, he talks about just how far you have to go. He has a section there. What about if a person left a suicide note? He has a paragraph there. Person left a suicide note. What would you think of that? At least a suicide note.
Just go with it. It was too late.
100%. But he has an entry here, which I didn't photocopy. In other words, he has several there. He says, a person left a suicide. In other words, you would say, he left a suicide note. How much more explicit is that? He goes up on the tree. He goes, what didn't we see? We didn't see the actual act. Okay, so you get where we're holding right now? So till now, we basically have said, this is the halachas of suicide. This is where we are. And bisman hazeh, lo aleinu, if it happens, then we accord full burial rights, 100%, end of story, no questions asked, and there's nothing to be for a person with suicide. That I don't know. Like I said, I don't have, didn't do my practical 101. So. Okay, so now, in the last few minutes, which I'm going to be running out of time, what's the obvious next question? Does this apply to MAID? Because now, what are the requirements for MAID? So, prior to the new change that will come in very soon, right? Let's back up a little bit. MAID, 2015. There's a right in Canada. It is medically assisted death, medical assistance in dying. Fine, terrific, wonderful. So, the heter for MAID perhaps is number one. There's another person involved. It's not yourself, right? MAID is not. You don't take your own pill. MAID is something that you go to a clinic, a doctor, something is administered. So is that like Reb Chananya ben Teradion? That's number one. In other words, someone else is doing it. You're not doing it for yourself. We saw that concept. Now, number two, which is the other way.
One's choice, one's not choice. They want to kill him.
Right.
I don't understand the connection.
No, the connection is just.
Romans wanted to kill him.
Right. So, Misha Nitna.
Clinic and say, hi, I'd like to die now.
Right. I hear you, but I'm just saying the concept of it being done by a third party. That's number one. But let's go further. In other words, the question that I think we have to basically confront is, till now we are comfortable, I hope, seeing that the Gesher HaChaim has evolved, that suicide today has a sensitivity that we are not going to do this. Now the question is going to be, because it's going to be a real question. The rabbi is going to get a phone call. He's going to get a phone call from, somebody by the name of Goldberg, Greenberg, whatever, only to find out at some point that the person took advantage of the MAID. Now, do you say that you would, do you treat him as a ma'abed la'atzmo ladas or not ladas? So what would be the svara that you would think about? So before we go any further, let's just pause and think. We have enough background now. Can you use any of the heterim that we came up with for the exceptions in a case of MAID?
To some extent you can, because...
Which one? Which one?
He's going to say, I want to take that pill, and the doctor's going to give him that pill. He could change his mind as he starts to swallow the pill, but it's now too late.
Oh, so you're saying like, okay, I'm backing up. Good point. That's a reason why you would say that a completed act of MAID perhaps is not. It would still be. I'm going back a step. What about anything we've learned tonight that would say it would be permissible? Shaul HaMelech. What was the reason for Shaul HaMelech? We saw different reasons for that. Hananya ben Tradion. So the question that comes up there, Rav Asher Weiss asks is, we saw Tosfos said that for Yisurin, pain, you're allowed, right? That's a Tosfos. What do you think of the notion of this of using one of the heterim?
Well, it's a burden on the family.
I'm sorry?
You're creating a burden on the family which you want to remove, because you're terminally ill. You don't want to prolong your life because it's a burden on the family to look after you and the suffering.
Right, no. So the question is, can you use the idea that the person is in so much torture, so much pain, so much, to quote the words of Tosfos, Yisurin, can you apply that halacha? That's really fundamentally what it is. In other words, the question that's being tongue-in-cheek really is, can we come up with a heter for MAID? Now, lest anyone leave before I finish, the answer is emphatically no, and there's no way around. But this would be the question, and this was asked of Rav Asher Weiss. Okay, so can you answer that? So what is the distinction that he makes? And I thought you were going to go that direction. The distinction that he makes is the following: one is inflicted by the pain comes from a goy and things of another. Another one comes from who? God. Although you can say that they're all God. Yeah. You can technically say that they're all from God, right? So whether you're being chased by a Gentile, or whether you have, God forbid, a terrible cancer and pain, I mean, God is the one. But he differentiates. Rav Asher Weiss wants to differentiate between the two. He says one is Yisurin, is a machla, and that is not the same as a thing. So that's his approach to trying to say that don't come up with any heter. But I want to tell you a fascinating story that he shares with us, because now the question I want to ask is, okay, so now that we've done that, if you have to, now, the rules of MAID in Canada as of now, not yet to be changed, but as of now is the person has to be able to give consent, right? So we're not talking in Canada where a person who is at a point where they're beyond the ability to, so they have to be justified.
They're changing that in Quebec.
I know that. I'm saying that as of right now.
No, I know.
So the case of MAID right now is someone who is declaring and signing that they are competent and they understand it. Now, if that, and so do we have all the parts that we need to be called that ma'abed latzmo ladas? What do we need? We need the willingness, the consent. We have the willingness and the desire. He meets the criteria. We witness it, right? What are we missing now?
Well, he's not doing it to himself anymore.
I know he's not doing it, but what I'm saying is, but
He's missing aiding.
He's just, but the person's just an instrument.
the doctor is there. The doctor. In other words, the question is. In other words, I'm asking a theoretical question as a halachic, and saying, would everything that we learned about till now, ma'abed latzmo ladas, to say, okay, bottom line, can we bury them in the proper, give them kvura and anything like that? A person who comes now and the rabbi finds out, oh my God, this person, was died because of MAID. The argument might be, does he meet the criteria that we outlined in the Gesher HaChaim and in the Chassam Sofer? He gave consent. He acknowledged. He was in full capacity. What are you going to say now?
If he's in terrible pain, then he's not in full capacity.
Okay, so then there's a problem with the law the way it was written, because the law that was originally designed was that you have to have full capacity and full consent. That a psychologist, Gerard, would say he meets criteria. Right. The scary part is, coming next year to Canada, is that they're going to allow it for people with mental health. Well, now the whole thing is thrown out of the whole thing. Now it's not going to be a problem. So why is that going to be relatively easier from a halachic perspective? Because by definition, there's bilbul adas. The whole thing is bilbul adas. The person is in such a state of depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, whatever the comment's going to be. Of course he's not. They're going to call that in some form of capacity, whatever it's going to be. But at the end of the day, we understand from a halachic point. But right now, we don't have that window. So I'll end with a story from Rav Asher Weiss, and then you just understand. So Rav Asher Weiss was confronted by a person who was paraplegic from the neck down. And when I say approached him, the Shiloh was approached to him because obviously he didn't go very far. So the Shiloh was, he just said, I can't anymore. It's a young man, and he could not. He begged Rav Asher Weiss to allow him to go to Switzerland and to end his life. He begged him. And Rav Asher Weiss says, I absolutely did not allow him whatsoever what thing. Anyways, this is a frum man, davened every day and so on and so forth, whatever it's going to be. He finally decided he had enough. So he went off to Switzerland and he decided he was going to make that decision. Rav Asher Weiss tells the story that he told the family that they should go with him and they should daven with him and they should say vidui with him. Okay? And on that day, he goes, they put on tefillin, they davened, and he was the tzaddik of all being, but at the end of the day, he did what he had to do. When he came back to Eretz Yisrael, Rav Asher Weiss instructed the Chevra Kadisha, and this is the punchline, absolutely full rights of everything. Kvura, Hesped. And here, you had a person who was completely understanding his decision, consent, he just could not take it anymore. So the answer to the question, is there a difference even today? Rav Asher Weiss would say, based on the Chassam Sofer, that you can always find some way to recognize that such a person is not ma'abed atzmai ladas. That's a whole different. In other words, to find that kind of a person today, So all of the things that we've learned about or heard about, and all the myths about things like that, this is all pre the days of Chassam Sofer. Anyways, I hope that this was, at least it reached the sensitivity, and hopefully unfortunately this is Lamaisa very much for families, but it should be a schus on behalf of all those that have that. Somebody say Kaddish? Rabbi Chananya ben Akashar, Kodesh Baruch Hu Lazako says he's